This week, CoinDesk is taking a closer look at what's next for the state of crypto regulation. That's presented by Chainalysis. Joining us now to discuss is Multicoin Capital General Counsel Gregory Xethalis. Welcome to the show, Gregory.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we are talking about the Sam Bankman-Fried trial this morning. Last year, we learned that, well, at the beginning of this year, sorry, the time just all blurs together for me these days. Multicoin Capital's hedge fund lost 91.4% last year due to exposure to FTX and holdings in FTT and Sol-based tokens. How do you think this trial is going to set the tone for the industry, especially when it comes to regulation in the U.S.?
Well, I think, not going to talk about Multicoin's particular circumstances in relation to it, but clearly the FTX collapse and the trial is having an impact on the development of policy. A week from now, we'll be in DC at CoinDesk State of Policy discussing, what the path forward is. And I really applaud CoinDesk for this event in particular, having a concise event with a highly curated agenda and bringing both regulators, legislators, as well as participants from trade associations in both traditional finance as well as the digital asset ecosystem together to discuss the path forward. And clearly there is a desire and a need for a regulatory framework that allows businesses in the U.S. to operate and compete and do so with level playing field, the opportunity to innovate, and by virtue of coming within that regulated scope, providing additional consumer protection and business standards that we would expect of American companies, but may not always see for companies that operate outside the U.S.
But just to sort of bring up the obvious point here, which is related to what you said, is that FTX obviously was not a U.S. company. And I know people are saying that, well, we need better regulation in the U.S. so that these FTXs don't attract people. But I kind of feel like that's not the most compelling argument. That's like a great argument on paper. But the truth is that like there's always going to be these sort of offshore entities, right? And actually, I think the devil's advocate side is like the stricter. Okay, so say that all the crypto advocates' dream comes true, right? And like the U.S. actually has a regulatory framework for crypto and it's really strict and it looks more like Japan or Singapore, right? And it's easier to operate an exchange. That actually, in some ways, you could argue just increases the likelihood of these sort of offshore Wild West exchanges where you can do like way more exciting things with leverage, right? So it's kind of like how does really having a regulatory framework in the US really solve the FTX problem? Did you see what I'm saying? Like, I know it sounds like it does, but I'm not convinced that it actually does.
You're not going to have huge leverage perps that some people want on a U.S. regulated exchange. That's not happening in the near term. And there are some people who will be drawn to that. There will be listing standards that are different for exchanges that are global than are in the U.S. But there is something to be said for the soundness and regulatory certainty. And the lack of certainty makes it more difficult for people to invest and build in the U.S. and build compelling products. We have seen a handful of U.S. entities have success building products, Coinbase being perhaps the best example, but we've also seen success from Gemini and Paxos in building good product that struggles to compete because markets can access these offshore platforms that have less restrictions and less costs. I don't think it's a panacea to have regulation, but I think if we focus on the low-hanging fruit, the simple centralized entities, looking at things like stablecoin regulation, which is a clear immediate need, as well as things like Title III and IV of the Responsible Financial Innovation Act, which go towards investment contract status and being able to operate a U.S. exchange with a central federal regulator. Because one of the aspects that makes it very difficult also to operate a business in the U.S. is you have 53 different regulatory authorities that you have to adhere to. Each of the individual states, or 49 of them, the District of Columbia and 3 territories, if you want to operate a truly national exchange. And that's difficult. When I was in private practice, I represented exchanges from time to time. And the process of getting onboarded and dealing with 53 or 54 regulators instead of one is a very, very difficult thing.
The market conditions right now, with the collapse of FTX and Terra Luna, it removed a lot of leverage in the market. It made it we're seeing it now. Volumes are incredibly low. Does that buy time for regulators to deal with this problem in a different way than they would have had the market been hotter? I mean, we're talking, of course, people are looking at the ETF potentially launching, but so far, the volumes on the spot exchanges are nowhere near what they were before the collapse of FTX. Does this buy a little bit of time for regulators to sit there and think it long term, or remove some pressure to get it done right away, especially now when we have two wars, global wars, right now happening that Congress has to focus on?
I think there's some validity to that, in that the actual interconnectedness of a lot of the digital asset ecosystem to TradFi rails is somewhat limited. We saw that last August, I believe it was, or June. Fed Chair Powell testified before Congress, indicating that the Terra Luna collapse did not have a significant impact on the traditional financial system and systemic risk, because there aren't a whole lot of ties. We can't rely on that to stay that way forever, particularly when we're talking about truly centralized exchanges and centralized activities such as stablecoins, where we have to move quickly because it's not necessarily going to be just regulators in the room. We need Congress to take some action and create frameworks for things like federal preemption of state regulation. A really core issue for stablecoin issuers, digital asset trading platforms, and digital asset custodians. Again, to avoid that scenario where you have to deal with 54 different regimes instead of one. So I think we can't rest on our laurels, but we can perhaps have some satisfaction that the nascency and infancy of the industry means that we have time to try and get it right, but we can't sit on our hands. We've got to move quickly. And I think that's the theme for next week, is ensuring that the right people are in the room having this type of conversation, and, hopefully coming out with takeaways that help move the ball forward, including on, some legislation in the House, which appears to be bipartisan.
I want to bring up one more theme that came from the contagion that was part of the knock-on effect of FTX's implosion. It came up again in Sam Bankman-Fried's trial over the last 2 weeks, and that is due diligence. There is this big question about how VCs were looking at due diligence when they all got involved with FTX. Now there's this question about how folks in the industry are approaching due diligence in a post-FTX world. How are you looking at due diligence as we move forward? What are you doing differently?
So, processes change always. I'd rather not go into the specifics of how we think about things, but we always try to do a best-in-class operation in every aspect of what we do, whether that's legal, finance, investing, and we take our responsibility very seriously.
All right, Gregory, we're going to have to leave it there this morning. Thanks so much for joining the show, and we'll see you at the State of Crypto.